The sky above the battlefield had forgotten how to be blue. For weeks, it had worn the color of old bruises, a slow purple wound spreading from horizon to horizon. And beneath it, the Fourth Shinobi World War continued to devour everything that once resembled peace. Ash drifted like patient snow across the ruined plains, settling on broken armor, on shattered kunai, on the still faces of the fallen who no longer needed names. Somewhere in the distance, a drum of thunder rolled without rain, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the balance of the world was about to shift in a direction no prophecy had ever recorded. Sensors in every hidden village felt it before anyone could name it. In Konoha, an old shinobi pressed his palm to the trembling floor and whispered that the chakra of the world had grown a new heartbeat. In Kumo, a sensor collapsed with tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to explain what she had touched. In Suna, the sand rose in slow spirals without wind, drawn toward a point on the map where nothing should have existed. It was not the pulse of a tailed beast. It was not the signature of a forbidden jutsu. It was something older, quieter, and infinitely more precise, like a single note struck on an instrument no one in this world had ever built. Far from the war, in a forest where the trees still remembered what green meant, a man opened his eyes. Gojo Satoru rose slowly from a crater that had not been there a moment before. His white hair caught the light like frost on morning grass, and his blindfold hung loose around his neck, revealing eyes the color of a sky no longer visible above him. He remembered the rupture. He remembered the impossible geometry of a technique he had never intended to release, the way space itself had folded around him like paper crumpled by a careless god. He remembered falling, though there had been nothing to fall through, and then arriving, though there had been nowhere to arrive. The air here was wrong. Not hostile, not poisoned, simply unfamiliar. Cursed energy did not answer his call the way it always had. Instead, something else moved through the world, threading itself through every leaf, every stone, every drop of dew that clung to the moss beneath his boots. It flowed in rivers he could see with terrible clarity, gathering in living things, pooling in the roots of ancient trees, whispering through the veins of insects and birds and the distant heartbeats of frightened animals. His 6 eyes drank in the sight of it, and for the first time in his adult life, Satoru Gojo felt the quiet thrill of a student encountering a subject he did not yet understand. He named it in his mind before anyone could tell him what it was called: chakra. The word arrived without effort, as though the world itself had leaned close and murmured it into his ear. He walked. There was no reason to hurry, and hurrying had never suited him. The forest thinned into fields that had once been farmland, and the farmland gave way to a village that no longer deserved the word. Roofs had collapsed inward like the ribs of dead animals. A doll lay in the middle of a road, its painted eyes staring at a sky that had failed it. Somewhere behind a broken wall, children were breathing as quietly as they could, small lungs disciplined by the kind of fear no child should ever learn. Gojo did not enter the village. He stood at its edge and let the weight of it settle into him. He had seen suffering before. He had lived inside it, worn it like a coat, taught students who wore it too. But this was suffering that had been sewn into the fabric of a civilization, accepted as weather, endured as season. Somewhere in this world, adults had decided that endless war was simply the shape of things, and the children had learned to agree. He was still standing there when the white Zetsu came. There were 7 of them, pale and grinning, emerging from the tree line with the certainty of predators who had never known refusal. They moved toward the ruined village with the loose eagerness of hunters closing on wounded prey, and the small breaths behind the broken wall grew smaller still. Gojo tilted his head, curious rather than alarmed. He raised one hand almost lazily, and the world rearranged itself around his fingers. He did not destroy them. Destruction would have been easy, and easy things taught him nothing. Instead, he undid them gently, the way one might untangle a knot. Space folded around each pale figure, and each pale figure ceased to be a problem. It took perhaps 3 seconds. When it was finished, the forest was quiet again, and the children behind the wall were still alive, and Gojo Satoru stood in the road with dust settling around his boots and the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. An old woman crawled from the ruins and called him a sage. A scout on a distant ridge lowered his eyes from a spyglass and began writing a report that would eventually reach Madara Uchiha and Naruto Uzumaki and Kakashi Hatake and every commander of the allied shinobi forces. A man who cannot be touched, the scout would write, whose techniques belong to no element and no clan. Far beneath the earth, in a place where forgotten things had been sleeping for longer than history remembered, something ancient stirred. Kaguya, dormant and dreaming, felt a shape enter her world that had no place in the destiny she had woven. And though she did not yet wake, her dream turned darker. Gojo, unaware, lifted his eyes toward the distant horizon where a colossal chakra burned like a second sun, and quietly wondered what kind of world he had fallen into. Gojo Satoru learned the shape of the 5 great nations the way a traveler learns the geography of a dream. He walked because walking gave him time to think, and thinking was the closest thing to prayer he had ever practiced. The roads between villages were narrow and haunted, worn smooth by generations of soldiers who had marched away as children and returned as ghosts. He passed shrines whose bells had been melted for weapons, wells whose stones bore the fingerprints of the dying, orchards where the fruit hung untouched because the hands that once picked it had long since become names on a memorial wall. Everywhere he went, he listened. He listened to farmers who spoke of shinobi the way villagers in his own world had once spoken of curses, with a resignation that had hardened into faith. He listened to old men who remembered 3 wars and could not tell them apart. He listened to a girl no older than 9 who explained, in the careful voice of a scholar, how to hide her chakra so that enemy censors would mistake her for a rabbit. She had learned the trick, she said, from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, who had died before she could pass it further. Gojo said nothing while she spoke. When she finished, he crouched to her height, adjusted his blindfold, and told her that rabbits were far more clever than most soldiers. She laughed for the first time in a season. He walked away, carrying that laugh inside his chest like a stone he had chosen to keep. Word of him spread faster than he traveled. The mysterious traveler, the white-haired sage, the man whose eyes saw through mountains. Rumors reached the front lines in fragments, contradicting one another, and yet each version agreed on a single detail. He did not fight for a village. He did not fight for a cause. He fought only when children were in the way of blades, and even then he fought with the reluctance of a man who found violence tedious rather than glorious. Naruto Uzumaki heard the rumors while resting between skirmishes, and something inside him quickened. He recognized the shape of the story without knowing why. That evening he broke from his division, followed the whispers of civilians and the reports of scouts, and found Gojo sitting on a hillside beneath a sky that had finally, briefly, remembered how to be blue. Their first meeting was almost disappointingly quiet. Naruto expected a warrior. He found a man eating a rice ball and squinting at the horizon as though it had personally offended him. Gojo glanced up, took in the boy with the whisker marks and the eyes that carried too many people inside them, and offered him half the rice ball without ceremony. Naruto sat down. For a long while neither of them spoke. When words came, they were not the words of enemies measuring one another. Naruto spoke of bonds. He spoke of the belief that had carried him through every impossible night, the conviction that connection between people was the only true weapon against despair. He spoke of Sasuke without bitterness, of Jiraiya without tears, of a future in which shinobi would not have to become monsters in order to protect the ones they loved. Gojo listened the way he rarely listened to anyone. When he answered, his voice was softer than his reputation suggested. He agreed that bonds mattered. He agreed that love was, in its quiet way, the strongest technique any human had ever developed. But he added something Naruto had not expected. He said that winning wars had never saved anyone in the long run, because the generation that won always taught the next generation how to fight. The only true victory, Gojo said, was raising children who would never need to learn what their parents had learned. Protect the next generation and the war ends. Protect only yourselves and the war simply pauses. Naruto did not agree entirely, neither did Gojo. But when they stood as men who had recognized something in one another, and the respect between them was the kind that grew slowly and refused to fade. Sasuke Uchiha met Gojo 2 days later, and the meeting went differently. Sasuke felt the power radiating from the stranger and did not like the way it refused to bow to any village, any clan, any allegiance. Power without a leash, Sasuke thought, was power waiting for an excuse. He said little, watched much, and walked away with his suspicions sharpened. Kakashi, Hatake, and Tsunade Sundu approached the newcomer with the careful curiosity of scientists. They studied him, and he studied them, and in a series of quiet conversations beneath medical tents and command banners, Gojo began to understand chakra the way a musician understands a new instrument. He could not play it the way they did. His body was not built for hand seals or elemental release. But his 6 eyes traced the flow of it with such precision that he began to see resonances between chakra and cursed energy, both of them born from the wild territory of human emotion, both of them shaped by the choices of the civilizations that inherited them. 2 rivers, he thought, from the same distant mountain. Beneath the earth, in a place no one had thought to look, Black Zetsu felt the pattern of fate stretch and shudder. He investigated the stranger with the patience of something that had waited millennia for its moment, and what he discovered filled him with quiet horror. Gojo Satoru was not written. He did not appear in the tapestry the sage of 6 paths had woven. He was an unaccounted thread, and every unaccounted thread threatened to unravel the design. Madara Uchiha received the reports with a slow, appreciative smile. Curiosity in a man like Madara was more dangerous than rage. He decided that Gojo would become either the greatest obstacle to infinite Tsukiyomi or its most magnificent ally. Either outcome pleased him. Either outcome could be arranged. Days later, a message reached Gojo, folded like an invitation to an old friend. Madara Uchiha requested the pleasure of his company. He wished, the letter said, to show him what true peace looked like. Gojo read the letter twice. He read it a 3rd time not because the words changed, but because the handwriting told him things the words did not. There was elegance in it, and loneliness, and the kind of certainty that only belonged to men who had stopped questioning themselves a long time ago. When he was finished, he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inside of his coat, the way one keeps a memento of a conversation that has not yet happened. He did not accept the invitation. He did not need to send a reply. Madara Uchiha would understand refusal the way rivers understand stones. The confrontation found him 3 days later in a valley whose grass had already surrendered to ash. Madara descended from the sky as though the sky itself had been waiting to lend him. His hair moved like slow black water, his armor caught what little light remained, and behind him the sun bent respectfully around the silhouette of a truth-seeking orb. When his boots touched the earth apologized. Gojo did not bow. He did not draw a weapon because he had never carried one. He simply lowered his blindfold, and his 6 eyes opened onto a world that suddenly stopped pretending to be simple. The first exchange was not violence, it was measurement. Madara studied the stranger with the appreciation of a craftsman appraising unfamiliar steel. Gojo studied Madara with the delight of a scholar who had finally found a text worthy of translation. Around them, the valley held its breath, and somewhere on a distant ridge, Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha stopped mid-stride as they felt the pressure of 2 impossibilities meeting. Madara moved first. A Susanoo, the color of grief, unfolded around him, blades of translucent chakra sweeping through the air with the finality of a closing book. Gojo did not step aside. He simply stood, and infinity stood with him, and every blade slowed as it approached him until motion itself forgot how to continue. The Susanoo pressed against nothing, and nothing was patient, and nothing did not tire. Yet Madara was not a man to be discouraged by inconvenience. Limbo clones stepped from planes of existence Gojo had never encountered before, and for the first time he felt something press against his infinity from an angle his eyes had not been trained to see. He adapted within a breath. His 6 eyes learned the geometry of limbo the way they learned every new curvature, and soon he was moving between the visible and the hidden as though he had lived there all his life. Truth-seeking orbs drifted around him, tasted his defenses, and returned unsatisfied. But Madara's chakra was godlike, and godlike things had subtle weight. Gojo felt his assumptions bending. In his own world, cursed energy had been finite, mortal, familiar. Here, Madara's reserve was a sea that refused to show its floor. Every technique Gojo unleashed cost him more precision than he was accustomed to spending. Hollow purple, when he finally released it, tore a wound through the sky that did not close. Neither man fell, neither man triumphed. They separated by the mutual, unspoken agreement of two beings who had recognized that this first meeting was only a rehearsal for a longer conversation. Naruto and Sasuke arrived while the dust was still settling. Their approach was cautious, their weapons ready, their eyes flickering between Gojo and the ruined valley behind him. Sasuke spoke first, his voice cold as tempered iron. He did not trust the stranger, and he said so. Naruto, who had already made his own decision, extended his hand anyway. Gojo looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then took it lightly, as though testing whether it might vanish. The alliance formed there was uneasy, held together by necessity rather than affection. It did not need to be more than that yet. War rarely asked for friendship. It only asked that people stand in the same direction long enough to survive the next hour. That hour came quickly. Zetsu forces surged across the plains, and behind them Madara's shadow generals moved with grim purpose. Gojo fought alongside the shinobi, and something in the way he fought unsettled the veterans who watched him. He did not chase kills. He did not seek glory. When a wounded civilian stumbled through the smoke, Gojo turned from a certain victory to catch her before she fell. When a young shinobi froze in terror, Gojo placed himself in the path of the strike meant to end that shinobi's life. Old commanders who had forgotten what protection looked like remembered, quietly, that once upon a time their profession had meant something other than killing. The battle escalated. Naruto's sage chakra flared like a bonfire. Sasuke Amaterasu carved black scars into the air. And whenever Gojo unleashed hollow purple, the world flinched. Fractures appeared in the sky, small at first, thin as spider silk, but they did not close. Beneath the earth, ancient seals older than any recorded history began to tremble. Symbols that had slept for eons remembered they had once been alive. The Sage of Six Paths appeared to them that evening, half spirit, half memory, his voice carrying the weight of ages. He looked at Gojo not with suspicion but with sorrow. He explained gently that the barriers separating worlds had been built long before the first shinobi had ever spoken a jutsu. Those barriers had held because nothing in this world had ever been strong enough to test them. Gojo's arrival, and more importantly, Gojo's techniques, had begun to loosen locks that were never meant to be turned. Something older than Madara was waking beneath the earth, something older than the tailed beasts, something older perhaps than chakra itself. The sage's warning hung in the air long after his image faded, and Gojo, for the first time since arriving in this world, felt the quiet, unfamiliar weight of consequence he had not anticipated. The days that followed were not days of war, though the war had not ended. They were days of listening, of walking, of turning over old stones to see what history had hidden beneath them. Gojo, Naruto, Sasuke, Kakashi, and the spectral presence of Hagoromo Otsutsuki traveled together into regions of the elemental nations that no map bothered to name. There were mountains here whose peaks had not seen human footprints in centuries. There were valleys where the moss grew in patterns that resembled writing, and there were rivers that ran clear enough to show a bed of stones inscribed with characters older than any language still spoken. They came at last to a ruin that did not appear on any map. It sat inside a bowl of gray hills, half swallowed by the earth, its stones the color of old bone. There were no signs of battle here. There were no scorch marks, no broken weapons, no graves. It was as though the people who had built the place had simply set down their tools one evening and walked away, leaving the walls to argue with the wind. Kakashi was the first to enter. He walked with the caution of a man who had learned that curiosity, in his line of work, was usually punished. His flashlight found murals painted in pigments no modern artisan could reproduce, and the murals told a story that contradicted almost everything he had ever been taught about chakra. In the earliest paintings, chakra was not a weapon. It was not even a tool. It was a bridge. Figures stood with their palms open, and threads of soft light passed between them, joining hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. The painting showed no jutsu. They showed conversation, communion, a civilization that had used its greatest power to listen. Naruto stood before those paintings for a long time. Something in his chest tightened until it hurt. He had spent his life believing that bonds were the answer, but he had always assumed that the bonds had to be built despite chakra, in the spaces between battles. He had never imagined that chakra itself had once been the language of bonds, and that his ancestors had somehow forgotten how to speak it. Sasuke, for his part, stood before a different mural, one that depicted the moment the language had been broken. The figures in this painting were no longer joined. They stood apart, and the threads between them had thickened into chains, and the chains had hardened into weapons. Above them, a great eye opened in the sky, and Sasuke recognized in it the shape of ambition that had haunted his own bloodline for centuries. He said nothing. He did not need to. Gojo walked the ruins with a stillness that his allies had not seen in him before. His 6 eyes traced the residual energy in the stones, and what he saw both fascinated and troubled him. Chakra, in its original form, had been almost identical to cursed energy in its emotional foundation. Both were born from the reservoirs of human feeling. Both drew their strength from what humans loved and feared and refused to let go. But somewhere along the paths of 2 different worlds, the same source had been shaped into 2 different destinies. One civilization had turned it into curses. Another had turned it into weapons, and in both worlds, the original purpose, the bridging, the listening, the joining, had been abandoned. He wondered then whether power itself was cursed, whether every gift great enough to change a world would, in time, be twisted into a reason to conquer it. He did not answer his own question. He was not sure the question had an answer. The nights in the ruins were long and quiet. The travelers ate simply and slept badly. Naruto spoke to Gojo often during those nights, and their conversations grew deeper than they had been at the beginning. Naruto asked whether peace won through battle could ever truly last, and Gojo told him honestly that he did not know. He said only that peace built on victory tended to remember its enemies, and peace built on understanding tended to forget them, and that forgetting, painful as it was, might be the truer foundation. Sasuke listened more than he admitted. He watched Gojo choose to challenge destiny without demanding authority in return, and something in the observation reshaped a part of him that had long been hardened against reshaping. He did not thank Gojo. He did not even speak to him directly, but he began quietly to walk closer to him than to the others when the path narrowed. While the travelers explored the ruins above, Black Zetsu worked in the shadows below. He had watched Gojo's arrival with growing alarm, and every day that passed confirmed his fears. The dimensional instability caused by Gojo's techniques was accelerating the weakening of ancient seals, and Black Zetsu, patient architect of his mother's return, saw in that instability an opportunity too perfect to refuse. He whispered into the fractures. He nudged the loose stones of destiny. He offered the world's oldest prisoner a doorway that had not existed a season before. On the final night in the ruins, Hagoromo appeared to Gojo alone. His spirit was thin, translucent, and grave. He told Gojo what none of the others yet knew. The rupture that had brought him to this world was not healing, it was closing. And when it closed, it would seal permanently, sealing Gojo inside a world that had never been meant to hold him. There would be no return home. There would be no version of this story in which Satoru Gojo walked back into the school in Tokyo and greeted his students and complained about paperwork. That door was already narrowing, and soon it would be a wall. Gojo received the news the way he received most news, with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He did not grieve aloud. He did not curse. He simply looked up at the fractured stars and thought, for a moment, of the students he would never see again, and let the thought pass through him without breaking anything he still needed. Before dawn, the earth shook, not from battle, not from jutsu, from something else, something waking. Deep beneath the ruins, in a chamber older than the world's memory, Kaguya Otsutsuki opened one eye ahead of schedule, and destiny itself began to rewrite the ending it had been promised. Kaguya rose without ceremony. There were no trumpets in the sky, no armies gathering to hail her return. She simply stepped forward, and reality stepped aside to accommodate her. The world she entered was not the world her son had prepared for her. It was a world already destabilized, already leaking, already tremulous with the presence of a foreigner whose techniques had bent the walls between dimensions. She recognized the bending immediately. She recognized the foreigner too, though she had never seen his face. Her first act was not violence. Her first act was reorganization. She reached into the fabric of the world and rearranged it. And where there had been one sky, there were now three, layered like transparent silks, each showing a slightly different sun. Where there had been one earth, there were pockets of impossibility, floating meadows, inverted rivers, forests that grew downward from the underside of clouds. The allied shinobi forces, scattered across the continent, suddenly found themselves scattered across dimensions instead, cut off from one another by veils they could not cross. Gojo felt the change before he saw it. His 6 eyes registered the way space itself had been unstitched, and for the first time in years his infinity flickered, not failed, flickered. The border between him and the world, which had always been absolute, thinned in places where dimensional interference intruded. A stone thrown by an ordinary shinobi would still not touch him. But something thrown by Kaguya, or by the shifting realities she now commanded, might. The margin between untouchable and vulnerable had narrowed to a hair. He did not tell the others at first. He carried the knowledge quietly, the way a physician carries a diagnosis before finding the right moment to share it. But Kakashi noticed. Kakashi noticed everything, and the tightness around Gojo's mouth, the slight delay in his responses, the way his hand occasionally moved as if to confirm that the air still resisted him. All of it told a story the veteran did not need translated. The setbacks came in waves. An entire division of the allied forces vanished into a dimension of white sand and silent lightning. Another division found itself trapped inside a forest where the trees whispered in Kaguya's voice and the ground swallowed anyone who slept. Sakura, leading a rescue operation across an unstable rift, managed to save 18 shinobi and lost 23 in the same afternoon. She did not cry until she was alone. When she did, she cried quietly, the way medics learn to cry, so that no patient would ever hear. Kakashi began to doubt. It was a slow doubt, the kind that arrived without drama and settled in like weather. Every strategy he devised was outdated within an hour, because the battlefield itself refused to remain the same shape twice. He had spent his life mastering deception, but Kaguya deceived reality, and there was no counter-jutsu for that. He continued to lead. He continued to plan. But at night, when the maps were rolled up and the tents were dark, he sat with his hands over his eye and asked the darkness what a general could possibly do when even the ground beneath his boots had become a stranger. Sasuke felt the old hunger stir in him again, the hunger for control. It was quieter now than it had been in his youth, but it was still there, and Kaguya's return had woken it. He watched Gojo struggle, watched Naruto exhaust himself, watched the alliance fracture along the lines of fear, and a part of him whispered that the only reliable answer to chaos was mastery. He resisted the whisper. But resisting it cost him, and every hour of resistance drained something he could not name. Naruto struggled hardest of all because he had built his life on inspiration, and inspiration required an audience willing to hope. His allies were no longer that audience. They were tired. They were grieving. They had watched too many friends fall through cracks in the sky. When Naruto spoke of belief, the words landed softly and did not bounce. He kept speaking. He kept trying. But he began to understand for the first time why Gojo had said that winning wars was not enough. He could feel his generation being spent in front of him, and he could not think of how to stop the spending. Gojo, meanwhile, was learning humility the hard way. His entire adult life had been built on the quiet, unspoken foundation of being the strongest person in any room he entered. That foundation had cracked. He was still extraordinary, still dangerous, still capable of feats no other person in this world could imagine. But he was no longer untouchable, and untouchability had been more than a technique for him. It had been an identity. It had been a way of moving through grief without letting the grief reach him. He began, slowly, to lean on others. He asked Kakashi for tactical advice and listened when it was given. He accepted Sakura's medical attention when a rift interference cost him a moment of pain he could not hide. He worked alongside Naruto rather than in front of him, matching the rhythm of a team instead of dictating it. It felt strange, and then it felt correct, and then it felt overdue. Black Zetsu chose that moment to strike. He had been waiting for the Alliance's trust to fray, and it had frayed enough. He whispered into the ears of frightened shinobi that the foreigner's techniques were the true cause of the fractures. He arranged for evidence that Gojo's hollow purple had opened the seals beneath the earth. He nearly succeeded in isolating Naruto during an ambush, and only Sasuke's reluctant intervention saved the Hokage's future from ending in a ditch beneath a dimension that no longer had a name. Kaguya, throughout all of this, grew. She absorbed the leaking energies of collapsing dimensions the way a great tree drinks from a flooding river. Her power, already vast, became something the human vocabulary had never been built to describe. Her voice, when she finally spoke to the world, was not loud. It did not need to be. It simply arrived in every mind that could still hear, and it said, without malice, that resistance had ended. The heroes gathered in a broken sanctuary at the edge of a shattered plateau. They were bleeding, they were fewer, and they were, for the first time in the war, unable to imagine winning. Hope did not die that night, but it lay very still, and it did not speak. The sanctuary was old, older than the war, older than the villages, older, perhaps, than the boundary between the world above and the world below. It had been built into the roots of a mountain by hands whose descendants had forgotten the shape of their own ancestors, and its walls were carved with symbols that Hagoromo himself had not fully translated. Those who entered it found that their voices grew quieter without their choosing. Grief in a place like that no longer felt like weakness. It felt like a kind of prayer. Naruto sat with his back against a stone column, his hands still shaking from the day's losses. Sakura tended to Kakashi's wounds without speaking because there were no words she had not already spent. Sasuke leaned against the far wall with his eyes closed. Though he was not sleeping, he was listening to the sound of a plan he could not yet hear. Gojo did not stand at the head of the room. He sat among them, on the same cold floor, and for a long while he said nothing at all. He was not gathering courage. He was gathering the correct silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it had been in earlier days, softer, and yet it carried through the chamber the way water carries through hollow wood. He told them, first, that they had all been trying to become stronger. He told them, second, that becoming stronger was no longer the answer. Kaguya could not be defeated by increased power, because Kaguya's power scaled with the dimensions she had unlocked, and every unlocked dimension had once been sealed by the same barriers Gojo himself had helped to weaken. Stronger, he said, was a trap. Stronger was the road that had brought them here. He asked them, instead, to become clearer, to understand one another the way musicians in an orchestra understand one another, not through domination but through timing. Naruto was not the strongest of them, though he liked to pretend otherwise. Sasuke was not the fastest, though his pride insisted. Sakura was not the most delicate, though her hands had convinced her. Kakashi was not the wisest, though the years had almost persuaded him. Each of them, Gojo said, had misidentified their own gift, and each of them had spent years training around a lie. He spent that night, and the nights that followed, teaching. He did not teach jutsu. He taught listening. He asked Naruto to describe in detail what he felt when he sensed Sasuke's chakra approaching, and he asked Sasuke to describe in equal detail what he felt when he sensed Naruto's. They discovered over hours of careful conversation that neither of them had ever truly examined the sensation. They had grown up together and never once compared notes. When they finally did, their combined awareness became something neither of them had ever possessed alone. He worked with Sakura on the geometry of her chakra release, not to make her stronger, to make her more precise, so that a healing pulse she released could travel through unstable dimensional fractures and still find the wounded body it was meant to reach. He worked with Kakashi on the older forms of space-time ninjutsu, the ones his father had studied and his teacher had refined. and he showed him how those forms could be layered with the spatial principles of limitless to create doorways that Kaguya's shifts would not immediately close. He gathered old rivals. He gathered enemies who had spent the last 2 years trying to kill one another. He gathered survivors from villages that had spent generations at war. He did not lecture them about forgiveness. He simply asked them, one by one, what they would regret leaving unsaid if extinction arrived tomorrow. Most of them, when they answered honestly, discovered that their regrets pointed toward the same people they had been fighting. The tailed beasts joined them in that sanctuary, drawn by Naruto's growing bond and by the ancient symbols that recognized them as kin. Kurama, once a prisoner, now a partner, watched Gojo with the wary respect of a creature who had lived through many humans and rarely found one worth his time. Gojo returned the look without flinching. Between them a quiet understanding formed, the kind that requires no promises. In the middle of that long preparation, something happened to Gojo himself that none of his students noticed at first. He stopped trying to be the strongest sorcerer in the room. He had never fully belonged to that title anyway. It had been a coat he had worn because the world had insisted, and the world had never asked whether the coat fit. In the sanctuary, surrounded by people who had begun to trust him, he set the coat down. What remained beneath it was something he had not admitted to himself in years. He was a teacher. He had always been a teacher. His deepest satisfaction had never come from winning. It had come from watching a student walk past him into a fight he could not have survived alone. He accepted the role publicly on the 7th night. He did not make a speech about it. He simply began in the morning to introduce himself differently, not as Satoru Gojo, the strongest, as Satoru Gojo, who taught. The shift was small, and yet everyone who heard it felt something rearrange in the room, the way a household rearranges when a new lamp is finally lit. The coordinated strategies they built in that sanctuary were unlike any doctrine the Shinobi World had produced. Limitless was woven with 6 paths chakra. Sealing arts were braided with the geometry of domain expansion. Space-time ninjutsu was fitted to the rhythm of tailed beast cooperation. Sakura's medical arts were reshaped to travel across dimensional interference. Kakashi's leadership was reframed around delegation rather than command. Naruto and Sasuke, at last, learned to fight not as complements but as a single organism with 2 hearts. When they marched out of the sanctuary, the sky above them was a broken thing, streaked with the borders of colliding dimensions. Kaguya's stronghold waited beyond the horizon, patient as inevitability. The alliance was smaller than it had been at the beginning of the war. But it walked differently now, in a rhythm the world had not seen before, and Gojo walked among them, not ahead of them, not behind them, simply among them, the way a teacher walks with students who no longer need to be led. The final battlefield did not have a single shape, it had many. Kaguya's stronghold sat at the center of a shattered geometry, a spire of pale stone rising through the seams of overlapping realities. And to approach it, the Allied forces had to pass through terrain that refused to remain one thing. A desert became a sea. A sea became a chessboard of drifting islands. A forest turned into a mirrored corridor where every shinobi met a version of themselves they had once tried to forget. The march to Kaguya was not simply a march, it was a confession. Naruto led the united army with the calm of a man who had finally stopped needing to be loved by everyone he protected. He no longer shouted promises. He no longer bargained with his allies. He simply walked at the front of the line, and where he walked, the line held. His clones moved through the columns like living bridges, closing gaps, steadying the wounded, whispering to the frightened. When a division vanished into a dimensional fold, another Naruto walked into the fold to bring them back. He did not always succeed. When he failed, he did not pretend otherwise. That honesty, more than any technique, kept the army moving. Sasuke fought at the flanks, and the choices in front of him were sharper than any blade he carried. He could still smell the old vengeance. It had never fully left him. On the eastern edge of the battlefield, he encountered Uchiha remnants who had chosen Kaguya's side, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to end them the way his clan had ended itself. In fury and finality, he hesitated. He remembered, without wanting to, the way Gojo had refused the easier destruction of the White Zetsu in that first ruined village. He remembered the way protection had cost more than annihilation and had been worth the difference. Sasuke did not spare his enemies out of mercy. He spared them out of a slow, unwelcome understanding that mercy might be the only choice that did not turn him back into what he had been. Sakura commanded the rescue divisions, and she did so with a ferocity that quieted anyone who had ever underestimated her. She built triage stations across 3 dimensions simultaneously, using the space-time doorways Kakashi had refined. She pulled shinobi out of collapsing realities with a precision that would have been impossible a season earlier. When a young medic broke down beside a dying friend, Sakura knelt beside her, guided her hands into the correct seal, and reminded her that healing was not about saving everyone. It was about refusing to give up on anyone while they still had breath. Kakashi did not fight at the front. He fought at the center of the strategic web, redirecting divisions, opening and closing dimensional corridors, sending Naruto's clones where they were needed and pulling wounded units to Sakura's stations. He led without pride and without theatrics. When his subordinates asked him what victory looked like, he told them honestly that he did not know and that he would settle for survival with dignity intact. His command, for the first time in his life, felt like fatherhood. It suited him. Gojo confronted Kaguya alone on the highest tier of the stronghold, beneath a sky that no longer bothered to pretend it was a sky. She waited for him without impatience. She had waited longer than the memory of the world for someone worthy of her attention, and she recognized in Gojo the shape of that someone, though she did not yet understand why. Their battle did not resemble combat as the Shinobi World understood it. It resembled a conversation between 2 languages that had never before been asked to translate one another. She struck at him with the raw geometry of dimensional shifts, and he answered with the folded logic of limitless. She reshaped the ground beneath his feet, and he reshaped the space above her head. Hollow purple met an attack that had no name in any human tongue, and neither technique won. They canceled one another and left behind a silence that echoed for hours. Kaguya did not tire. Gojo did. His infinity flickered more often now, and the flickers were longer, and each one cost him a piece of the composure he had worn all his life. But he had stopped fighting to win. He had begun fighting to understand her, and understanding in a battle like theirs was the only weapon that mattered. He saw her at last, the way his 6 eyes had been trying to see her from the beginning. She was not evil. She was alone. She had been alone for so long that solitude had become the only shape she trusted. She could not comprehend the humans who fought beneath her, because she could not comprehend the willingness of one small life to be spent for the sake of another small life. The idea of sacrifice was, to her, a mathematical error. It did not compute. And in that inability lay the only crack in her infinity that he could exploit. He turned to the sky and called for Naruto and Sasuke, not to defeat her, to seal her. The seal required an anchor, a fixed point around which the collapsing dimensions could be stitched back together. Gojo did not explain what anchoring would cost him. He did not need to. Naruto understood the moment he arrived. Sasuke understood a second later. They looked at their teacher, and their teacher smiled the way a man smiles when he has finally, after a long life, found something worth losing. The sealing ritual took every technique they had spent the sanctuary nights refining. Naruto and Sasuke joined hands across the fracture and channeled the combined chakra of the 6 paths through a lattice that Gojo held open with the raw force of his limitless. Sakura's medical network stabilized the shinobi who had begun to slip through the tears. Kakashi coordinated the corridors that funneled dimensional energy back into its original chambers. And Gojo, at the center of it all, held the breach open with a strength that no longer came only from himself. Kaguya was sealed. She did not scream. She only looked at Gojo, and something in her ancient eyes, for a single moment, softened into something almost like recognition. Then the seal closed, and she was gone, folded back into the prison that had waited for her. The dimensional breach began to collapse. Gojo did not step away from it. He turned to Naruto and Sasuke and Kakashi and Sakura, and he said something quiet that none of them would ever fully repeat, because it belonged to them alone. Then he stepped into the collapsing rift, and the rift closed around him. The war ended in the silence that followed. There were no cheers. There was only the sound of soldiers at last, setting down their weapons and beginning, slowly, to remember how to weep. Peace, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived as a long exhalation. The elemental nations, exhausted beyond memory, did not know how to celebrate a victory that had cost so much and had felt, at the end, less like triumph than like survival with wounds still open. There were no parades in the first month. There were only burials and reunions and the quiet work of counting who was left. Villages that had spent generations across borders from one another began, for the first time in living memory, to rebuild together. Konoha stonemasons traveled to Suna to help repair aqueducts. Kirigakure fishermen sailed lumber to Iwagakure for the reconstruction of collapsed academies. Kumo blacksmiths retrained themselves as tool makers rather than weaponsmiths, and the tools they produced traveled across every border without inspection. It was not that the old enmities had vanished. They had simply become embarrassing. Everyone had lost too much to too many strangers to pretend that strangers were the problem anymore. The story of the mysterious teacher spread faster than any official chronicle. It moved from mouth to mouth in the shape a good story always takes, growing details in some tellings, losing them in others, keeping only what mattered. Some said he had been a sage of an unknown clan. Some said he had been a spirit sent by the Sage of Six Paths himself. Some said he had been a man from another world, though those who said it often smiled as though they were joking. He had white hair. His eyes could see beyond chakra. He had chosen protection over victory in every fight anyone remembered, and at the end he had chosen to close the door of the world with himself on the wrong side of it. Children asked their parents to tell the story again. Parents told it, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, always with a softness that surprised the parents themselves. Something in the telling of it had begun to reshape the way adults spoke to their children about strength. Naruto, who would soon accept the title of Hokuge in a ceremony that felt too small for what he had lived through, carried the teacher's philosophy into the framework of the new Shinobi era. He did not phrase it as Gojo would have. He phrased it as himself, but the core was recognizable. He proposed that academies would no longer train children as weapons. They would educate them, in the older sense of the word, drawing out rather than pouring in. Cooperation would be taught before combat. History would be taught honestly, including the parts that shamed the villages that had committed it. And no child would be sent to a battlefield before they had been given the chance to imagine a life that did not require one. Sasuke did not stay in Konoha. He had never been suited to sitting still, and his redemption was not the kind that could be completed inside walls. He traveled alone, sometimes with Sakura, sometimes with no one at all, and he sought out the fragments of the ancient world Gojo had helped them rediscover. He found ruins no one else had found. He translated murals no one else could read. He carried what he learned back to Naruto in careful reports, and slowly the two men who had once nearly killed one another built, together, a body of knowledge that would guide the next century. Sakura built her medical academies with the calm efficiency of a woman who had discovered her true vocation late and did not intend to waste a single day of it. Her academies did not only train medics. They trained the entire village in the basics of care, so that no wounded shinobi would ever again die within reach of someone who did not know how to help. She named the largest of these academies after no one in particular. She said the name would come in time. It did. Kakashi retired from active service earlier than anyone had expected. He did not vanish. He wrote. He wrote the true history of the war, including the parts that reflected badly on the villages he had loved, and he published it in a form accessible to every literate child in the nations. He wrote about Gojo without exaggeration. He wrote about the teacher who had not asked to be a teacher and had become the greatest one the world had known. Some critics accused him of embellishment. Kakashi replied only that he had, if anything, understated the truth. The critics eventually stopped writing. The book kept selling. The ancient ruins stabilized, but they did not fall silent. Scholars who camped near them reported strange readings, trace energies that did not belong to any known chakra nature, faint blue lights that appeared and disappeared in patterns too regular to be accidents. The scholars filed their reports. The reports were quietly filed away. No one wanted to speculate too loudly, because speculating too loudly might reopen doors that had been closed at terrible cost. But children who visited the ruins with their families sometimes asked, in the innocent way children have, whether the teacher was still there. Their parents, who had grown up on the story, did not always know how to answer. Some said no, some said yes. Some said, most honestly, that they did not know, and that not knowing was itself a kind of hope. The world, in ways too many to count, had become a different world, not a perfect one, not a finished one, but one that had begun to imagine itself differently, and imagination, in a civilization that had spent so long forgetting how, was the beginning of everything. Years turned into decades, and decades turned into the quiet space where memory becomes legend and legend becomes belief. The Shinobi World, older now, grayer at its temples, had entered an age it had never dared to hope for. Children born in that age did not know what a rationing card was. They did not know the sound of an evacuation bell. They knew the names of famous teachers before they knew the names of famous warriors, and they thought that was simply how the world had always been. The elders did not correct them. The elders had earned the right to let the young believe in a peace that had always existed. Stories of the white-haired wanderer had settled into the shape all great stories eventually settle into. He was a figure spoken of at bedsides, painted in murals, sung about in the songs travelers sang along the coastal roads. His eyes, the stories said, could see beyond chakra itself. His hands could hold the sky closed when the sky wished to open. His greatest lesson, the storytellers always finished, was that true strength existed to nurture others and never to stand above them. Children learned the line before they learned to write their own names. Naruto, older now, his hair streaked with silver, sat often on the balcony of the Hokage residence and looked toward the horizon the way old men look at the places their youth had happened. He reflected, in the way old men reflect, that Gojo had changed history not by defeating every enemy he faced, but by dismantling the beliefs that had made enemies inevitable. It was the harder work. It was the slower work. It was the only work that lasted. Sasuke, older but still restless, continued to travel. He carried a satchel that held fragments of stone from the ancient ruins, and the fragments still resonated faintly with an energy no scholar in the nations had ever been able to name. He did not try to name it. He simply carried it the way one carries a letter from someone who has not written back. Sakura, whose academies now spanned every village, was consulted in her old age, not only on medicine but on ethics, on education, on the shape of institutions. She answered every question with the same patience she had once used to close wounds. Protecting life, she said, was as heroic as winning battles. It had taken her a long time to believe it. She spent her remaining years making sure the next generation would not have to wait as long. Kakashi finished his final book in the last year of his life. It was a full account of the dimensional visitor, written not as history but as testimony. He included things he had never told anyone else. He included the conversations that had happened in the sanctuary. He included the exact words Gojo had said to them at the edge of the collapsing rift, words the four of them had agreed to keep to themselves, and which Kakashi released at last because he did not want the words to die with him. The book, when it was published, was read in every village. Children who could not yet read had it read to them. Beneath an ancient shrine in a chamber that had been carefully preserved by generations of quiet keepers, a light began to glow. It was not a bright light. It was familiar, and it was blue. The chamber's guardian, a woman whose grandmother's grandmother had been the guardian before her, watched the light without alarm. She had been trained to expect it. She had also been trained not to expect too much. The distortion in the air above the light was small. It was not large enough to open a portal. It was not large enough to allow anything through. But within the shimmering, for the briefest moment, an indistinct silhouette became visible. It wore a blindfold. Its hair, though barely defined, was pale. It seemed for a heartbeat to look toward the guardian, and the guardian, without knowing why, bowed. The silhouette faded. The light dimmed. The chamber was quiet again. Somewhere beyond the stars, beyond the dimensions that any scholar had mapped, the strongest sorcerer may still have been walking. He had left behind a legacy that could not be contained by cursed energy or chakra or any language a single world had invented. The Shinobi World had never been ready for Gojo Satoru. But because he had passed through it, it had become at last a world capable of imagining a different future. An imagination once awakened does not sleep again.